This is a review of Symptomatica and Aphorismyth, the third and fourth monographs by Brandon Ragnar Johnson. In a previous video we looked through his first two books, Chromophile and Vernaculus, so if you haven't seen that already, I suggest you start there, as this video is really part 2. So Symptomatica was published in 2008, and this is where we start to see a noticeable change in Ragnar's style. It's not like he completely changes direction or anything, it's still very much the same style and sensibilities, just an evolution of that. Specifically, what I see is the works becoming a little more surreal and arty, and definitely more detailed and complex. I would go so far as to say over-designed, compared to the more clean, minimalist lifestyle vector-type art from his early digital years in Chromophile. He actually comments on this transition in the book very briefly, as in the second book there's very little text, and even less good text, but I definitely appreciated that he at least acknowledged it, as it is very helpful and important in thinking about the works and the books themselves. This book's the one where the layout is the most different. Whether it's better or worse, I'm not sure. But you can see, in stark contrast to the first two books, there's basically zero blank space anywhere in this book. Most of the works fill the entire page right up to the edges, though this can be a very, very bad thing, as when you see this sort of thing in books, it sometimes means that works have been cropped in order to fill the page. Whether that's the case here, I don't know. Also, like pretty much every book ever published, the use of one image displayed across two pages is terrible 9 times out of 10 in all 4 books, though that occurs rarely enough that it's really not a big deal. It's funny, in the introduction for Symptomatica, Ragnar mentions that this is the final book, or at least the end of the Vector trilogy, and I suppose that's kind of true in the sense that the 4th book, Aphorismyth, does feature more traditional paintings as opposed to the first 3 books, which were made up almost exclusively of digital work. But for all true purposes, this really is the 4th book in this series. It's still very similar and in keeping with the others. However, even though this is the 4th book in the series, it's actually Ragnar's 5th monograph, and this is where things get a little, if not confusing, then at least curious, and that's because the 3rd book, Symptomatica, was published in 2008. The 4th book in the series, Aphorismyth, was published in 2013, but there was another monograph published between them in 2010 called Aphorismyth. There'll be a dedicated review on that book, but it's weird because it's a book from a different publisher, self-published I think, and in a completely different format that does reprint works from the earlier books, yet 3 years later he chose to return to the old format / publisher, and I'm very curious as to why this was the case, as it's a rather inelegant disruption to an otherwise elegant and consistent series. By the way, I have no idea if I'm pronouncing Aphorismyth correctly. It's presumably a blending of aphorism and myth, so it could be aphorism myth, but that sounds a little too distinctly divided, whereas I think shifting that stress a little bit to Aphorismyth sounds more natural as to how a real word would be pronounced, and I think it's the most fun to say, so I'm going to go Aphorismyth. Aphorismyth maybe even sounds most real of all, but maybe too distant from its root word. I don't know. Anyway, Aphorismyth has 0 text besides a seemingly irritable and maybe even immature 2-sentence intro. It's also definitely my least favorite in terms of content, with the focus being more on graphic design and over-designed surrealist style nonsense rather than just refined, straightforward pin-ups, posters, or illustrations like in the earlier 2 books particularly. Though there is still a bit of that stuff on display and it's great, but in terms of book design and layout, with the exception of a couple of pages, this one's by far the strongest. Particularly layout, visual appeal, and use of color. It seems a bit more involved and thought out, which was a real relief because his other book that came out before this one that I mentioned, Aphorismyth, was, as far as I'm concerned, an embarrassing and baffling failure. More on that in the next review, but that Aphorismyth bounces back from that, I like to see as evidence of him learning and getting better with designing the books, which is cool to see someone who cares about that since so many others don't. I'd love to see them reprinted in 2 volumes, the first 2 books in 1 volume and the latter 2 in another. That won't happen though, but there are some other Ragnar books you may want to check out. Specifically, The Art of Big City, which is kind of like a concept art book for a proposed IP. I think that's such a cool idea and wish more artists and creators released books like that. But for this one specifically, I didn't end up getting it purely for personal reasons. Robot stuff doesn't really appeal to me, but still a great book, well worth looking into for all fans of Ragnar's work. You can see a little bit of the big city art in Symptomatica. He has another book called Kings of the Road that I really know nothing about. I think it may be more like a storybook, and then a couple of others that are all less than 50 pages, which as far as I'm concerned makes them too small to count as real books. In terms of recommending similar artists with art books worth checking out, I mean there's potentially zillions depending on what you're identifying as similar, but in terms of that sort of vector style, the two that mainly jump out to me are Ryan Hughes' art book, which I have reviewed, as well as Mike Malley's art books, which I have not reviewed. Feel free to drop any others in the comments, and again, if you really want to be disappointed, you can check out the review of Ragnar's other art book, Ebony Monstrous.